The content presented in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. The narratives discussed are based on historical cases, generally 40 years or older, using publicly available information, reconstructed storytelling, and interpretive analysis. While care is taken to present events accurately, certain elements may be condensed, adapted, or presented for narrative clarity. The psychological insights and analyses offered are speculative in nature and do not constitute formal diagnoses, clinical evaluations, or definitive conclusions about any individual's mental state, intent, or behavior. This podcast does not provide medical, psychological, or legal advice. Listeners should not substitute any information presented here for professional consultation with qualified practitioners. All views expressed are intended to explore patterns of human behavior and decision-making, not to assign guilt, establish fact, or replace official findings. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to The Missing Why. People will tell you what they did. Some will even tell you how they did it. But the why is almost always edited or buried, because the real reasons are rarely clean. They're shaped by fear, by ambition, by ego, by pressure that never makes it into the story. Every decision leaves a trace. Every action exposes a pattern. And most people spend their lives hoping no one looks closely enough to connect them. This is where we do. We study the fracture points, the contradictions, the quiet motives operating behind composed language and controlled appearances. Because beneath every polished narrative, there is something else. And once you see it, you don't unsee it. The house stood in Orvault, a quiet suburb just outside Nantes, a place where sound doesn't travel far, where movement is noticed, where patterns settle in and stay that way. The kind of neighborhood where mornings repeat themselves, same doors opening, same cars leaving, same lights turning off at night. Ordinary, routine, predictable. A family of 4 lived inside. No known conflicts, no visible instability, nothing that suggested disruption, nothing that suggested fracture. And then, in February of 2017, they vanished. Not loudly, not violently, at least not in a way the outside world could hear. Simply absence. No calls, no messages, no digital trace of departure. Their phones stopped where they last were. Their routines stopped mid-pattern. The cars were still there, cooling in the driveway, as if they hadn't been touched in days. Personal belongings remained exactly where they should have been. Coats hung, shoes aligned, objects undisturbed in a way that felt too deliberate. The house itself appeared intact. No broken locks, no shattered glass, no visible point of entry. But something was off. Not obvious, not immediate, subtle, the kind of subtle that sits in the air before you understand it. There were traces, small, fragmented, easy to overlook if you weren't looking closely enough. Dark stains, not pooled, not fresh, but present, embedded into surfaces where they didn't belong, partially cleaned, wiped, but not erased, the kind of cleaning that suggests interruption or urgency, not enough to confirm anything immediately, but enough to suggest something had already happened, something contained, something that did not leave the house. The family did not leave. They were removed from inside a structure that had not been forced open. No breach, no external disruption, which means the event did not begin as intrusion. It began as access. Access granted without resistance. Doors that were opened, not broken. Spaces that were entered without hesitation, which narrows the field because access requires recognition, and recognition lowers defense. As the investigation expanded, a connection surfaced, a relative, not distant enough to be irrelevant, not close enough to be constantly present. Someone who could arrive without raising alarm. Someone who could stand inside that house and not feel out of place. Someone who knew the layout, the entry points, the blind spots, the rhythm of the people inside. And more importantly, someone who carried a belief, not a suspicion, not a passing thought. Something fixed, something settled. Because what followed was not random. It did not unfold. It was constructed, deliberate, layered, already decided before it began. To understand this case, we remove a common assumption that violence requires immediate justification. In structured cases like this, justification is not reactive. It is pre-built, formed gradually, reinforced internally, left unchallenged long enough to stabilize. No external validation required. No contradiction strong enough to disrupt it. The offender believed something specific, that the family possessed items that rightfully belonged to him. Not suspected, believed. That distinction matters. Suspicion allows for hesitation. It leaves space for re-evaluation. Belief closes that space. Once belief is established, opposing evidence is filtered out, not ignored, reinterpreted. No forced entry, no immediate signs of chaotic resistance, which indicates the initial interaction did not trigger alarm. It was processed as safe, familiar, allowed. That moment matters. because the shift from safety to threat did not happen at the door. It happened inside, at close range, where reaction time shortens, where trust delays response. This introduces a specific mechanism: cognitive entitlement. The offender does not frame the act as violation. He frames it as correction. Within that structure, the victims are not seen as owners. They are seen as holders of something misallocated, and resistance from them is not interpreted as defense, but as obstruction, an obstacle to be removed. Once that internal position stabilizes, escalation becomes procedural, not emotional. There is no surge required, no loss of control, because the narrative has already aligned intention with action. The act is no longer a decision point. It is merely a step. The aftermath becomes critical. The attempts to clean, to reduce visibility, to manage the physical environment after the event. These are not disorganized actions. They are controlled, sequential. The behavior does not fracture after the violence. It continues, which indicates continuity of mindset, not collapse. That continuity tells us something precise. The act itself was not the peak. It was not the breaking point. It was one phase within an already active process, a process that began with belief and transitioned into enforcement. This is not impulsive violence. It is internally authorized violence, and internally authorized actions are resistant to interruption because they do not register as wrong within the This is not impulsive violence. It is internally authorized violence, and internally authorized actions are resistant to interruption because they do not register as wrong within the individual executing them. There is no internal signal to stop. So the relevant question is not, why would someone commit this act? It is what happens when a person no longer distinguishes between what they believe and what they are justified in doing. Because once that boundary dissolves, there is no negotiation, no recalibration. This case feels easier to explain, at least on the surface. There is conflict. There is escalation. There are decisions that appear deliberate. But that's exactly where the misinterpretation begins. Because clarity in behavior does not always mean clarity in motive. So instead of asking what he did, we need to examine how he justified doing it. Start with baseline. Not just who this person was, but how they understood themselves. Because in this case, behavior is not random. It's consistent with an internal narrative. Some individuals do not organize their lives around stability. They organize around control of environment, control of perception, control of outcomes. And over time, that control becomes identity, not something they use, something they are. To maintain that identity, the brain builds a supporting story, a framework where their actions are justified, their perspective is correct, their responses are necessary. This is not conscious manipulation. It is cognitive alignment. Reality is adjusted to preserve internal consistency. Now introduce disruption. Someone challenges the structure, not just behavior, but authority. And this is critical. The threat is not experienced as disagreement. It is experienced as destabilization. Because if control defines identity, losing control feels like losing self. At this point, escalation becomes predictable, but not in the way people assume. It doesn't begin with violence. It begins with justification, reframing the other person, minimizing consequences, elevating perceived necessity. By the time the act occurs, it no longer feels extreme internally. It feels consistent. Several distortions typically appear in this structure. Entitlement framing. I'm justified in this response. Moral inversion. They cause this outcome. Control bias. I need to restore order. These distortions reduce internal resistance. They don't remove awareness. They remove conflict. This is where most analyses fail. They focus on intent. But in cases like this, intent is downstream. The real driver is justification. Because once an action is justified internally, execution becomes easier. Not because the person lacks awareness, but because the action fits their constructed logic. Now examine what follows. Does the individual attempt concealment, maintain narrative consistency, show selective acknowledgement? These are indicators of preserved identity structure. Unlike the previous case where the system collapsed, here the system remains intact, which is more stable and more dangerous. This case aligns with control preservation violence, where the act is not about emotional overflow, but about restoring or maintaining dominance over a perceived disruption. The individual is not reacting impulsively. They are acting in alignment with a self-consistent framework. The confusion in this case comes from overestimating emotion and underestimating structure. This is not someone who lost control. It's someone who believed they were maintaining it. That distinction changes everything because it reframes the act from breakdown to enforcement. The most dangerous individuals are not always unstable. Some are perfectly consistent in how they think, consistent in how they justify, and consistent in how far they're willing to go to protect the version of reality that they have built.
What makes a case like this difficult is not only what happened, it's the silence around why it happened. Because when you hear a story like the one Phil just walked us through, the mind naturally starts searching for order. We want the facts to line up. We want the motive to reveal itself cleanly. We want the behavior to make sense in a way that feels complete. But human beings rarely break in clean lines. Most of the time, the truth lives somewhere more uncomfortable. It lives in pressure. It lives in fear. It lives in obsession. It lives in humiliation, dependency, control, shame, resentment, fantasy, and emotional collapse. And that is why this show exists. The missing why is not about who did what. It is about the deeper structure underneath the behavior. It is about what kind of internal world has to exist for a person to cross a line that most people spend their lives avoiding. Because violence does not always begin with violence. Sometimes it begins with a wound that never gets processed. Sometimes it begins with someone feeling invisible. Sometimes it begins with control slipping away. Sometimes it begins when a person builds their identity around someone else, something else, or a version of life they believe they were owed. And when that identity is threatened, the person does not just feel disappointed, they feel erased. That is when danger begins to take shape. One of the mistakes people make when looking at a case like this is assuming that evil announces itself, that it arrives loudly, that it looks obvious, and it wears a clear face. But in many cases, the most dangerous person in the room may not appear dangerous at all. They may seem ordinary, functional, polite, familiar. They may be someone people pass every day without giving a second thought. And that is what makes human behavior so unsettling. The exterior can remain calm while the interior is deteriorating. A person can appear controlled while privately unraveling. They can maintain routines, relationships, jobs, habits, social manners, while something inside of them is becoming more rigid, more desperate, and more detached from consequence. That is why motive is not always a single event. Sometimes motive is accumulation. It is not the one insult, it is 10 years of perceived insult. It is not one rejection, it's a lifetime of rejection being filtered through one moment. It is not one argument, it is the final rupture in a psychological system that was already unstable. And when we look at these cases, we have to be careful because the goal is not to excuse behavior. Explanation is not justification. Understanding is not sympathy. Analysis is not forgiveness. But if we refuse to understand the machinery behind human behavior, then we are left with nothing but shock. And that shock teaches us very little. The real question is not just how could someone do this? The better question is, what had to be true inside that person's mind for this action to become possible? That question takes us deeper. It forces us to look at dependency, control, shame, identity, fear, isolation, entitlement, emotional fixation, the private narratives people tell themselves until the narratives become stronger than reality. And that is one of the most dangerous things about the human mind. A person does not always react to the world as it is. They react to the world as they interpret it. A look can become disrespect. Distance can become betrayal. Rejection can become humiliation. Dependence can become abandonment. A normal boundary can feel like an attack to someone whose identity depends on control. That is where the psychology becomes important because in many of these cases, the tragedy does not happen simply because someone becomes angry. Anger alone is not enough. Millions of people become angry and never destroy lives. The danger becomes when anger fuses with entitlement, when pain fuses with obsession, when rejection fuses with identity collapse, when fear fuses with the need to control the outcome. That is when the person stops seeing other people as human beings and starts seeing them as a symbol. Symbols of betrayal, symbols of failure, symbols of humiliation, symbols of everything they believe has been taken from them. And once someone turns a person into a symbol, it becomes easier for them to do the unthinkable. That is one of the darkest patterns in human behavior, because destruction happens physically. Before destruction happens physically, it often happens psychologically first. The victim is reduced. The story is rewritten. The offender becomes the victim in their own mind. The world becomes unfair. The act becomes justified. And by the time violence occurs, the person may already have rehearsed the emotional logic of it long before the moment itself. That is why we cannot only study the final act. The final act is the explosion, but the real investigation is where the pressure system that came before it. Who was losing control? Who felt exposed? Who needed someone else to remain in their place so their own identity could survive? Who could have tolerated rejection, change, embarrassment, or uncertainty? Who had built a private version of reality that no longer survived contact with the truth? Those are the questions that matter, because in cases like this, the missing why is rarely simple. It is not always one motive. It may be a collection of motives layered over time. Some conscious, some unconscious, some obvious, some buried so deeply that even the person responsible may not have been able to fully explain themselves. That is what makes these stories so disturbing. They remind us that civilization is thinner than we believe. Most people are held together by love, routine, obligation, morality, consequence, family, faith, community, purpose, or fear of judgment. But when those structures fail, or when they were never strong to begin with, something more primitive emerge. And that is where tragedy lives. Not only in the crime itself, but in the breakdown before the crime, the missed signals, the private fixation, the emotional dependency, the need for control, the inability to accept loss, the refusal to let reality be reality. When you listen to a case like this, I do not want you to leave only with fear. Fear is easy. Fear is cheap. The harder thing is discernment. Ask yourself, what patterns were present? Ask yourself, what emotional systems were collapsing? Ask yourself, what people ignored because the truth was inconvenient? Ask yourself, where control was being mistaken for love. Ask yourself where silence became protection for dysfunction. Sometimes the horror is that people saw pieces of it but did not know what they were looking at. And that is why we study these cases. Not to sensationalize death, not to turn suffering into entertainment, but to look honestly at what human beings are capable of when identity, fear, control, and desperation converge. The missing why is about uncomfortable space between the facts and the motive, the space where behavior begins to reveal the architecture of the mind. And in this case, like so many others, we are left with the same haunting reality. The act may be over, the record may be written, the names may be known, but the why still asks to be understood. And sometimes the closest we get to the truth is not a confession, it is a pattern. This has been The Missing Why. I'm Oakley, and until next time, keep looking beneath the surface, because the answer is rarely just what happened. It is what had happened had been happening all along.
This was The Missing Why. If something felt off, it's because it was supposed to. Most people don't want clarity. They want coherence. Something that sounds right, even if it isn't. But the truth doesn't behave that way. It exposes. It disrupts. It forces you to confront the difference between what you believe and what's actually driving you. So before you move on, examine your own decisions. Not the version you explain to others, the one you avoid explaining to yourself. because that's where everything starts. And whether you acknowledge it or not, it's already shaping what happens next.